Welcome to Pirate Living Podcast. We are your hosts, Kristen and Karan. On this podcast, we are highlighting ordinary people living extraordinary lives. These are pirates who take small, bold actions daily to create social change. Pirate life is all about rebelling and breaking the rules for good. Creating lasting social change starts by first breaking our inner rules. After all, the hardest rules to break are your own. The pirates we highlight have dedicated themselves to creating good trouble.
Today, we're chatting with Stephanie Najjar. A political theorist by training, Stephanie aims to intervene at the level of the mind, of education, or broadening people's horizons and challenging folks to be better critical thinkers. She's a content creator speaking up against the deeply embedded patterns of white supremacy and in new age spaces, and works to inspire others, especially women of color, to take up space and to love themselves. So, welcome, Stephanie. We are excited to be chatting with you today.
Hi. It's so nice to be here. Thank you for having me.
So we would love to start by having you share with us the story of your pirate journey and how you got to where you are today.
Absolutely. So I was born in Lebanon, in Beirut, right at the end of the Civil War. And I remember when I was a kid, I was so distressed about the state of Lebanon, how destroyed the buildings were and everything. It was like being born in rubble. The country was really like a no man's land. It was really destroyed. And I kept telling my dad, I was like, Dad, we need a president. We need a president to fix everything. Why don't we have a president? I mean, it was a fail state. It still is really in bad shape. We didn't have a president for many years. I was like, we need a president to fix everything. Why are we? And I felt this helplessness. I mean, obviously I was just 3, but I felt this deep helplessness of we need someone to come fix it, to fix everything. And I realized, over the years that I use this metaphor now with my students that there is revolution with a capital R, which is these big historical moments where there's deep social change that happens suddenly. If you think of the Haitian Revolution, where enslaved Haitians overthrew the French, or if we think of the French Revolution, where the overthrow of the French monarchy, or if we think of the Bolshevik Revolution with the overthrow of the Tsars and feudal Russia and transitioning into communist Russia. So all of these are big moments in history. But there's also another metaphor that's really helpful and empowering for us to think about, especially when we're thinking in terms of social change and we're like, oh my God, we need things to change. How are things going to change? How do we make things better? We can think of revolution with a small r, as opposed to big R. And this is perfect with your framework and your motto that revolutionary change can happen in our quotidian daily lives. They can happen with choices that we make. And I like to think of this metaphor of think of a wall, for instance. The wall can seem really strong and hard to break down, but fissure after fissure, crack after crack, these tiny little cracks can make the wall crumble. It doesn't have to be this big crane that comes and destroys the wall. So if we think of social infrastructures and social change in terms of this wall, small r revolution is these little choices that we make in our ordinary lives. With ordinary people, and we're all able to make these choices, and they all start with education, conversation, self-awareness, reflection, and being in spaces like these where we talk, where we converse. So yeah, this was just a way to give a metaphor about big R versus small r. I also, so after growing up in Lebanon for a little bit, we moved to the Emirates with my parents. My parents are academics, and so it's no surprise that I also was an academic for a little bit. But so we lived in the Emirates, Dubai, which is right off of the Indian Ocean, where there's pirates there as well. And then when I was 13 years old, I moved to Montreal, and I've always had this social justice side to me. Maybe because I'm a Libra moon, So like justice is very important to me, but I was always like the kid in high school that was like feminist and would get bullied for being a feminist, because being a feminist back then like was not popular or cool. It was like uncool. But I decided to, when I finished undergrad, I decided to do a PhD, and I went to a political theory program at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore. So I was there for 6 years. So although I'm Canadian, I lived in the States for 10 years, almost 11 actually. And I decided that I wanted to study political theory. Why political theory? Because I wanted to understand how the world functions. I wanted to understand power specifically. Because what is politics? Politics is not just what we think of in terms of the government. It's not just like elections, although that is a big part of politics. So actually, if you do get a degree in political science, you have to study governments and elections and polls and things like that. But political theory specifically is more interested in power. What is power? Because power is not just in the government, it's also within people, it's also in relations. This is what we know of in terms of like power dynamics, in terms of intersectionality, in terms of how people are going to navigate this world differently based on who they are. Like that's what power is. So it's kind of like extending our analysis of power and politics into the social world. So it's not like, politics is just something that you look at out there that's just like on TV, on CNN. Like, no, politics and power is everywhere. It's diffuse, it's in our lives, it's in our relationships, and it's like how we navigate the world. So I studied that for a long time. I specialized in like Marxism. So because I really wanted to understand like capitalism and how that worked. But as a theorist, I have like broad training in everything from like old school political theory, like Aristotle and Plato, all the way into like decolonial political thought, Marxist political thought, all of that stuff that I'm more interested in.
Mm-hmm. And so, what are you doing now? So you were in that program, and then where has that led you to?
So I was in that program until 2021, at which point I decided to take a leave of absence, because I started the program when I was quite young. Immediately after undergrad, I decided I'm not done with school. I'm not done with thinking. I need more time to think. Because both of my parents are academics, like I really just didn't know what else there was out there for me. But I realized that, especially like I'm studying all this like, cool stuff, radical stuff, but I'm like, I feel so drained, and my self-confidence was really getting eroded by academia. Like I felt really small and shrunken and unseen. I started out, at 23 in the PhD, like I was so strong and confident and taking up space. And by the end, like 6 years later, I was really deflated and definitely burnt out, unhappy, and really understimulated. I was like actually kind of bored because and now, I took a year off, and I just like tried to explore to see like what else is out there for me. And I spent most of that year rebuilding my self-confidence, because I was really, really low self-esteem at that point, because I was like, what else? There's nothing out there for me. There's nothing that I bring to the table. I'm so useless. Like, I think there was just this sense of being really disconnected from the world. And obviously I was also like 29 and had been in school all my life. So, at the same time, all my friends and people, my peers of my age, they're working their way up in the world, and I'm like, I'm still in school. So that also contributed to like my lower self-esteem. So I decided to take some time off, and and just do self-care, really just do self-care. And that's when I was doing TikTok for self-care. I was just like doing little skits and dancing, and I thought the whole platform was really a space of healing for me, a space of joy. I was getting served content that was really like right up my alley, and really felt very connected to the platform. So after being on TikTok, I started being on TikTok like just as a viewer, as a consumer, in 2020. So after a couple of years of really being on it, I was like, okay, I'm just going to start creating now. I have all this free time because I'm on a sabbatical. And luckily, I'm very, very lucky to have a partner, my wife, who is working and was able to encourage me and support me in helping me like basically get out of this very like stuffy and asphyxiating environment that was academia. And I needed that help. I think I would have kept going and be unhappy. So thankfully it was good to have my partner who's not an academic at all. So she was able to be like, okay, you're clearly unhappy. Like, let's get you out of here. So it was really good to have that kind of like grounding support to kind of like pull me out, like throw me this lifeboat and be like, okay, let's, you don't have to keep doing this if you're not happy.
Was there,
So
sorry to interrupt,
yes,
was there something about the program or the environment that like in those 6 years that you would change from like this confident woman to someone that wasn't?
Yeah, I mean, now that I'm processing it, definitely. I was first of all in a very male-dominated space. There were like just a handful of women, and let alone like women of color, let alone like queer people. Political theory is very male-dominated. It's not like if I was in gender studies or in anthropology where there's a lot more diversity. Political theory is notoriously super masculine, super white. And I think the discipline itself is quite like specific. You have to constantly be criticizing. Like that's kind of like part of the exercise of political theory, is you have to be constantly saying like, this is what's wrong and this is how I'm going to make it better. And I think as an academic, I was much more interested in like spotting patterns, or I was gravitating a lot into like intellectual history and how thoughts traveled and how thoughts evolved and how like the discipline itself required me to show up in this like very specific way that was eventually draining. So when time came to write my dissertation, and having to write a dissertation and constantly like prove that this is your argument and this is why it's better, it drains me. And that's the thing with also publications, like you have to basically say like, okay, this is my argument and this is why it's special and this is why it's different and this is my literature review and this is where I position myself. And I was like, this is so exhausting. I just want to learn. I just want to think. I think I just did not do well with that particular, like the nature of the dissertation exercise. And also academia is very old fashioned. Like I don't think in most departments have not evolved to reflect like the current world that we live in. So the dissertation, I just think of it as a very antiquated exercise that can fit well with some people, but it doesn't fit well with me. Like I'm too abstract and creative and social to actually, like I didn't enjoy writing a dissertation. It was too solitary. It was too like formulaic and like, yeah, structured. There was like, there's a structure to it that I did not want to follow. I think some places now, like you can actually do a podcast for your dissertation, or you can write multiple articles for your dissertation. It's like, honestly, if there was that diversity of exercises like that, I would have picked a podcast, or I would have picked something that involved like public speaking, or because that's my strength. So a lot of things, but like I also felt very precarious at a university like Johns Hopkins. You'd think that a university that affluent would actually care about its grad students, but it did not. And during the pandemic, there was very little support for us, like no like extra kind of relief for the things that we were going through. We actually didn't even have, for the longest time, we had like a really bad like healthcare thing. And then the grad students started to organize. So there was, as soon as the university felt like there was a possibility that like maybe the grad students would unionize, that's when they really like upgraded our healthcare, and they gave us like dental, and they gave us vision, you know what I mean? So like I felt just so like I was working so hard for the university, and I felt so I felt like expendable. I really felt like expendable labor, and I did not like that. And I do that a lot, where if I feel underappreciated, or if I feel like I'm being like exploited in some way, I tend to get angry. That's how I feel towards TikTok now. But I'm like, why is this? What's this? This is so unfair. Like I am fighting for justice, but then myself, like my mental health and my body is being, like is deteriorating because of the environment that I'm in. So it's just like all this like compounded factors.
I with similar, like what you were saying at the beginning of the pandemic, I was getting angry. I worked in childcare, so teaching, but like childcare is viewed as lower even than a classroom teacher. And like schools were shutting down, classroom teachers were able to go home, work from home, but we were still expected to show up. And there were a bunch of teachers, childcare workers that were starting to get upset. Like, why do we not have a choice here? And we were like so close to people were going to riot and start up trying to get a union for childcare workers. And then they came along and were like, actually, you can choose not to work. You can go on furlough if you want, and we'll pay you, because they at this time thought it was only going to be 2 weeks. We'll pay you for the 2 weeks, so you can go home. And everything, like I was like, go for it, fight. Like, I know I'm quitting this job in 6 months, so I'll stand behind you, but I also am going to keep working here for 6 months, but fight. And then everything just went away just like that. And I was like, wow, we really gave in quickly to just being told you can go home and get paid for 2 weeks. I was like, it just takes a little bit for people to stop with the fight. And I was like, come on, guys. So yeah, it's interesting in that aspect too, that the humanity side of it.
Just going back to TikTok, since we kind of started this conversation before we started the podcast. And I mean, that is how I found you on TikTok. You showed up on my For You page. And so how did TikTok go? How did you go from being, a consumer on TikTok to creating the content that you do now?
It happened organically and totally accidentally. Okay, this is like maybe a little bit embarrassing, but I think it's important for me to talk about it because I think this happens a lot in the spirituality space. Like everyone in the spirituality space that I know has some kind of like embarrassing little adventure. So for me, I took this year, the sabbatical to explore, and I really got sucked into this new age thing called human design. Do you know about it? Have you heard about human design?
We've talked about it.
Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah. Okay. So human design, I think, appealed to me at that time because I was so uncertain about my life and so unsure about myself. I was literally did not know what to like. My self-esteem, my sense of self, my self-concept was so eroded by academia that I really relied on the tool of human design to help me like reconnect to myself and to realize like, oh, okay, like I have good things going for me, because that's the system, the human design system. Like you input like your birth information and it comes out, and if you get a reading, you learn like, oh, these are your energy patterns. Like you have a defined like throat center, so therefore that means that you're like a really strong, public speaker, or like you have a defined like third eye, so it means like you have a really unique perspective on the world. So obviously like I got a human design reading and I was like, oh my God, that's so true. These are things about me that I had forgotten, or that, there's something very comforting about someone that you don't know, like saying these things out to you. And you're like, oh yeah. Like it was very, very comforting, but I kind of took it further and decided to study it. And I think it came from this place of like, I just couldn't get enough of it. I just constantly needed more human design insight in my life, because I think it was part of like my process of rebuilding. But that's the thing, the danger is like when a crutch becomes like something that you really rely on. Mm-hmm. So I got really into it, and I was like to the point where I was like taking courses and I was like taking notes, and I had like notebooks full of human design notes. And then I eventually started wanting to offer human design readings. And I think there was a point in time where I was like, oh, maybe I'll become like a spiritual human design reader, or like a spiritual coach or something like that. So yeah, and I met someone on TikTok recently who was also on this, we call it like the grad school to spiritual pipeline, about how, like, you know, and I've been seeing it more and more, like now that I've, you know, see it, it's hard to unsee. But anyway, so I was definitely on that pipeline. And so my Instagram at that time was really, really full of like human design, astrology, tarot, all sorts of like woo-woo stuff, with a mixture of like healthy spirituality and a mixture of like toxic spirituality, but I couldn't see it back then. I couldn't see what was toxic about it yet. So anyway, at that point, TikTok was completely separate. It was a very personal account. I had like 50 followers. I didn't even know where those 50 followers came from. And I was just like posting things depending on my mood. Like it was just creative based. It was like depending on what I felt like doing, I did. So one day on my Instagram, I saw someone do a post about like money being energy. And that's when like the Marxist in me like kicked in, and I was like really angry. I was like, that's not true. Money is not energy. Like we live in capitalism. Money is compensation for waged labor. And when we talk about money's energy, we completely ignore and erase like the exploitation that is built into capitalism. And we just end up like pretending that like making money is just a question of like energy and like good attitude and good thoughts. And so I just was so angry. And to channel that, to work through my feelings, I did a TikTok about it. There was a trend, a very like just, you know, a fun trend that was like, oh, that's perfect for what I want to say. So I just used that trend, said the thing, and for the first time I went viral. So this was like in April with that post. It was, I don't know, I think it was like perfect alignment of like, it was a short video. It was something important that people needed to hear. So the views were doing well. And so I just posted it and like left my phone away, like put it away, and like was doing stuff. And we were watching Only Murders in the Building, I think, with my sister and my wife. And I picked up my phone, looked at it again, and I knew it was going viral because my views had never gone like beyond like 500 views. So at that point I was like at, you know, maybe like 5,000, and I was so excited. I was like, oh my God. And then like I'd refresh the page and we're at like 8,000, and like 10 minutes later we're at 10,000. It was like crazy. By the time I woke up the next day, we were at like 30,000. I was like, okay, this is crazy. And I was getting hundreds and hundreds of comments, and mostly people being like, thank you so much. Like, you're so right. Money is not energy. And then it started getting ugly, because that's what happens with viral, is like your content gets served not just to people who agree with you, but also people who disagree with you, because, you know, the post is doing really well. So it's generating controversies, generating conversation. So then I had a lot of people being like, no, money is energy. Like, you just don't know what you're talking about. Like, so then, you know, this was my first time. So I basically responded to every single comment. Like, if you go back to that video, I think I have like close to 600 comments on there. And that's when I realized, oh my gosh, like I have a lot to say. And I want to keep saying things. So then I kept saying things, mostly through dancing at first, but then people wanted more like explanation videos. So then I did more explanation videos. Things kept doing well. So I just kept doing it. And in doing so, I think the reason why I kept doing it was very healing for me as a teacher who left academia, to realize that I still can teach and can educate outside of academia in a way that feels very democratic and accessible and not stuffy. So I just kept doing it because I was like, oh my God, this is really fun, because I love teaching and I hadn't done it in a while, but I'm doing it in a way that feels relevant. And it's on this platform that has a lot of like people my age and young people who are curious and interested and engaged. And the teacher in me loves engagement. So I was like, okay, people are engaging. I'm happy. I'll keep responding and like educating. And that's kind of how I started building a community on TikTok, completely by accident, but like from this place of like wanting to start processing being in that spiritual space that I had been in.
Do you have a post that you made that has been the most controversial? Or a general topic that you return to that's the most controversial?
I would say I have like a few that generate a lot of controversy. The first one is manifestation, because I think there's still a lot of attachment to the concept of manifestation. People feel very strongly about it. So when I start saying, listen, like manifestation, it really, it's not like a spiritual law. It's just like made up. It's made up by white men in the 1800s who basically decided to like appropriate like like a Hindu concept, but it's not really appropriation. Like they appropriated it and distorted it to the point that it's unrecognizable. And they tried to like mix it with like Christianity. And basically it's this idea that your mind is over matter. So you can use your mind and think better thoughts and think differently and undo like the limiting beliefs that you have and undo the stories you tell yourself so that you can manifest a different reality. Um, and then, so when I tell people like, hey, listen, like thoughts are not enough in the society that we live in, because there are actual like systemic barriers that you can have the best thoughts, you can have the best attitude. But if you're, depending on where you're at in life, depending on your social and economic status, depending on your race, depending on the color of your skin, depending on all these different things, your gender, like these are also going to impact how you navigate life. But this concept of manifestation gains a lot of traction with white upper middle class folks, because it's true. For white folks who don't have systemic barriers, thoughts are the only thing that might be in the way. But that's not true for other people. So I kind of point out like the whiteness of manifestation, like how rooted in whiteness it is. And that generates a lot of feelings, a lot of like angry feelings that get angry feelings, but at the same time, like gratitude, people being like, thank you so much, because I knew something was icky about manifestation. I just didn't know how to put the words to it. So that's also like my job as a teacher, political theorist, like putting words to something is literally like why I'm here and what I do. So I'm like, yes, you're welcome. Like that makes me so happy to hear that I'm able to help you like articulate the icky feeling. So manifestation is definitely like very emotional. And then the other emotional topic is the divine feminine. When I talk about like the divine feminine as a 1950s like cosplay of gender roles that are, and a neoconservative backlash to like queer and feminist like progress, people get really emotional and they're like, no, like the divine feminine is not about gender, it's just about energy, it's about like reconnecting to the softness side, because we live in patriarchy and patriarchy just doesn't want us to connect to that feminine, and it demonizes the feminine. So it's all about reconnecting to the feminine. And in theory it sounds like a good project, but like once you start peeling the layers and deconstructing the divine feminine, like can have issues as well. So I think there needs to be deeper like social science conversations to the spiritual space. And that's really starting. And I think a lot of it is originating on TikTok, because there's a community of like critical people, critical thinkers who also are spiritual at the same time, who are interested in bridging the two. But currently the space is really lacking like critical thinking and like a critical exploration of the concepts. People just like take them at face value, and it's like, no, hold on, like let's unpack this, because not just because we're trying to be like annoying, but because there is a spiritual to alt-right pipeline that is very established. So we can't just, take these concepts at face value and not question them, because clearly there is a highway that's happening, and it's not happening it's not a coincidence. It's not a coincidence, because these concepts are actually neoconservative, but they're disguised as spiritual and woo-woo. But once you start unpacking them, the neoconservative quality of it becomes very clear. And that's why it's no surprise that you end up with spiritual influencers like saying really transphobic things, or really sexist things, et cetera, et cetera.
So yeah, can we dig more into that spirituality is, alt-right pipeline? Like where are the origins of that, do you think? And like how did this become a thing?
That's a really good question that I ask myself as well. Like, how did it originate? So we talk about this in my course, like Intro to Decolonizing Spirituality. So when we think of like the history of the New Age, we think of like counterculture, we think of these like hippie circles in the 70s and psychedelics and like and to a certain extent, it's true. I think there was a time where hippies were actually counterculture and they were anti-capitalist and they had like a critique of capitalism. Um, but it was always a predominantly white space. And as with, predominantly white spaces in general, like we're going to have issues with like whiteness. So the whiteness, I think from the very beginning of the New Age was never fully examined or brought under a microscope, sorry, for like examination. So from the very beginning, we have like whiteness issues. And by that, I mean like zero questioning about the concepts that are being brought into the New Age. Acting like these are concepts that are universal and spiritual and not really giving credit to the cultures that they come from, first of all. And second of all, there's a distortion of the concepts so that they can fit into like a Western audience and they can make sense to a Western like lens. Mm-hmm. So we don't really talk about the distortion of the concept. And the third element, sorry, I'm losing track of my.
We do it all the time.
Okay.
We're perfectly imperfect over here.
So okay, anyway, all is to say that there's appropriation that is being unexamined. There is also like this erasing the root of the thing that is being appropriated. So using concepts without saying, oh, this is from like this culture, this is from that culture, just acting like it's spiritual. And we still see this to this day, where you say, like, just because you say something is spiritual doesn't mean you absolve it of like contemporary politics. So like I'm thinking of an example of this like spiritual influencer who says, claims like twerking and oriental like dancing, belly dancing is healthy for the root chakra. It's grounding, it like regulates your nervous system, it helps you release fear, it helps you release emotions, because emotions are quote unquote stored in the hips. So just because you say something is spiritual doesn't mean you're absolved of cultural appropriation, and doesn't mean that you don't have to examine the cultural appropriation that comes with building an entire business empire on twerking and belly dancing, which are both don't belong to you culturally. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. So we see this trend often. We're saying something is spiritual, therefore I'm not going to examine the political implications of that. Another example, like saying, okay, like saging and Palo Santo cleanses the room, it cleanses the room of negative energy. So that's a spiritual claim. And so therefore, if we're talking about energy, we don't have to talk about, the destruction of the Amazon forest and all the cultural appropriation and theft of indigenous people that's happening. And we don't even talk about indigenous people's culture and indigenous people. Like when people sell Palo Santo, like no one's talking about like this being an indigenous practice, or there's this like willful forgetfulness and that, just being sold in, these like spiritual spaces. And so there's like this double erasure. There's like the cultural appropriation, but then also like we forget that indigenous people still use these tools and still have these practices that revolve around these tools. So it becomes very easy. So where I'm trying to get that point that I'm trying to get to with this is that when you say something spiritual, somehow it creates this like suspension, like you're all of a sudden in a different dimension, so you don't have to examine the problems of this dimension. You don't have to talk about racism, you don't have to talk about colonization and cultural appropriation and like whiteness, taking from other people, right? So it's like, oh, okay, so this is very comforting. This idea of not having to examine our responsibility is very comforting and becomes a breeding ground for the people who also agree with that kind of ideology. So neoconservative, white supremacists like love that stuff, because it's like, yeah, we don't want to examine our whiteness. We don't want to question. We don't want to do the work, right? So then it's like, you have a convergence, ideological convergence between spiritualists who turn their gaze away from the responsibility, and white supremacists and like neo-fascists and like people on the alt-right pipeline who also don't want to examine their responsibility. So you see how, so like ideologically, theoretically, there's already a point of connection between the two, and that's why there's kind of like been a revolving door between the two. Like alt-righters are going to find themselves very comfortable in spiritual spaces because no one talks about politics, no one talks about accountability and race and so you see how already there's a convergence. So I don't know like when it happened exactly, or like when the pipeline became established, but I can tell you that theoretically, the pipeline is like, it was already there, in the sense of just like the two have a lot of, they're mirrors of each other in a sense. Yeah. And so historically, we might still have this image of the new age being counterculture, but it became conservative and right wing really fast. And that pipeline is still there, and it's thriving today with people coming in at different points of entry. There is it's one pipeline, but there's many different points of entry. And so like the divine feminine being one of them, like maybe someone gets drawn into spirituality or interested in spirituality because they're feeling disconnected from their femininity, or they feel burnt out because capitalism is burning them out. And so the idea of the divine feminine feels very resonant, because they're like, yeah, I need to connect to my softness. I don't feel soft enough. I feel like I'm always like external, and I want to become more internal. But then the next thing that happens is you get exposed to this rhetoric that like the divine feminine, there's only feminine and masculine, and like there is no possibility of embodying both at the same time. It's very, the feminine masculine language is very, very binary. So of course, like queer people and people who don't think of themselves in this binary way, or they don't think of energy as binary, like what about being masculine and feminine, like it just, that and is really like not possible in that world. So then you end up with spiritual influencers who say very transphobic things that like that I won't like repeat here, but like it's just recently, I think like a month ago, there was an outburst on TikTok where an influencer said something like that, and people were so surprised, and I was like, why are you surprised? This is a symptom of the divine feminine creating a very deep binary. So if you buy into the divine feminine, you're next thing, further down the pipeline, you're setting yourself up ideologically for thinking that like trans people are somehow like abnormal because they're not embodying that like binary. So you see how that creates. So there's many different points of entry that can seem spiritual, but then and human design, honestly, like human design is one of them too. I wasn't really, human design, yoga, like all of these spaces can start pulling you down. I wasn't so deep into human design to see the parts, but theoretically I could see the parts, and I've been doing more content on human design on TikTok, and every time I do content I get so much engagement, to the point that it's like archival evidence for me, because people share their experiences as well. So I learn a lot. I learn a lot from people from the world, just like saying, oh, this happened to me, this is what happened, like so someone was telling me that like they were in the human design world, and like they listened to one of the lectures of the founder, and there's a lot of like cultic cultic obsession with the founder, who renamed himself, by the way. He's like this guy from Montreal, but he renamed himself Ra Uruhu. And like everyone in the human design world quotes him and reads him and listens to his lectures. So at one point, someone in the comments was like, yeah, I listened to a lecture of Ra Uruhu, and he was basically talking about like slaves, you know, like modern, you know. So I was like, okay, I'm not surprised at all. Like all of these new age spaces like kind of can take you down that road really fast. Yeah, and we see this also in my intro to decolonizing spirituality class, where any kind of personality system that's really obsessed with classification is a potential red flag, because where does classification come from? Like in terms of with colonization, classification was a huge point of concern and obsession, saying like, oh, you're white, or like you're a quarter this and you're an eighth this, and like in order to create, when you create classifications, you also create hierarchy. And when you create hierarchy, you basically say one person's better than the other, and so you also create space for like subjugating the people who are like lower in the hierarchy, you know. So like classification, obsessions with purity, miscegenation, all of these things are tied to that kind of like obsession with like classifying people. So like in these personality systems where there are classifications, people say like, yeah, no, everyone's equal, but it's like, no, it's very clear that when you read the personalities of human design, like there is one category in particular that is like hoisted as like the best, right? Like there's 5 energy types in human design, and manifestors were always the ones that were like so special. So already, like, you know, at the surface it seems like, oh yeah, this is really nice and it's comforting and it's supportive, but like if you get really into it and start unpacking, like that's when you start seeing, you know, you see problems.
Well, and actually just wanted to speak to like the whole with the founder and like how these things turn into like cult like status, right? And I don't know if you're familiar with the Nexium. Sorry, I just had extra dogs running into my house. Nexium, which was kind of started out, I don't think it was just Canadian.
It's the one that's all the Roman numerals, right? That
and how it started off as like a personal development, very much like what's that, landmark type thing. And I was listening to the story of a Vancouver woman who got really into the Nexium organization and started the Vancouver chapter, and how it essentially evolved into like this sex cult where all of these women were being recruited for the leader of Nexium, and branded, and all of these really weird, crazy shit that was going on, all in the name of like personal development, and of course then money making and making money for this, like the leader, who I believe also renamed himself, I can't remember exactly, but how this personal development basically turned into like this cult. So yeah, what you were talking about with the human design, like I had no idea about the founder or anything like that, but it seems to be such a common thing, like you said, where they turn into this like cult like organizations.
Well, like, even Lululemon, like that's a cult like organization, but it's run by a misogynistic male who so like
I think he's gone now, isn't he?
Possibly. But
also like, Vancouver, we're good at
Vancouver.
We're good at creating cults apparently.
So is Oregon.
Yeah, and I think also what's interesting with these spaces, personal development spaces, especially ones that have their own systems, is that they create like a language for how to understand the world. So at one point when I was like so deep into human design, like I would filter the world through the system itself, so be like, oh yeah, like she's reacting like this because she has an open throat energy center, and like my closed throat is impacting her. Oh, like this person is like tired because she has an emotional solar plexus, like, you know, like all these things that when you start living through that lens and it becomes your language and it really just like takes up your entire brain space, first of all, you don't have a lot of space left for seeing the world through a different lens, which is like maybe an anti-capitalist lens or a social justice lens. Like maybe this person's not tired because of like an open solar plexus. Maybe this person's tired because of like being burnt out at work. Like it just becomes it creates this very narrow and limiting framework through which you interpret everything, and it's very individual. It's hyper individualistic. Like you don't see things anymore through like a social lens or a big picture lens. You see everything through like that like micro energetic lens. And so it's very like navel gazy, and to me it feels it's a form of depoliticizing people, because it's like, oh, you're just so concerned about like energy centers and channels and stuff, and you're not thinking about like the big picture situations that are happening. So that's also like part of, you know, and in addition to that, you have your own language that can create like this, it can also prepare and prime for this like cultic you know, landscape, because you just have the same language as the other people who are also in that space with you, and you're all living in your same bubble, and that bubble is that system. So,
and on that too, there's a difference between like using, like you said in the beginning, with human design, using it as a tool, and that tool then becoming more than just a crutch. It becomes like your leg now. And learn, yeah, it's good to know though too that the tools, like you can take it and take little bits of it that like, hey, this helps me learn a little bit about me so that I can get out of my own head and navigate the world a little more, but also being aware, like, yeah, you don't have to deep dive into the cult part of it too, and being aware where it comes from as well. Like, oh, right, well, this doesn't have the best background to it. So what is my responsibility? What is my accountability here in this? And now that I have learned about this, like, where am I accountable? So yeah, can we talk more on the accountability part with it?
I would love to, because I think about this all the time. I decided to stop offering human design readings for multiple reasons. Like I was like, okay, well, first of all, I want to focus on being a teacher. And now that I have an audience of people who want to learn from me, I'm like, great, I want to be a teacher. I'm qualified to. And that's, you know, something I enjoy. So, but I think I decided to just avoid the problem of human design, because I was like, it's so much responsibility to be in a room and tell people what you see from a chart, especially someone that you don't know. Like there's already this like power dynamic that is established where they're coming to me for answers about themselves. Like, and that's tough. Like that's a tough setup. But I know that it can be helpful, and because it was helpful for me, but at the same time, it became addictive to me really fast. And the reason why I'm using the word addictive is because I never really thought of it as an addiction until I had a student in my class who was telling me about how she was addicted to psychic readings. Like, and she was getting, you know, like multiple readings a day and spending thousands of dollars every week getting readings. It wasn't that bad for me, but I was getting human design readings anytime I could. Like I would trade them with people, be like, hey, I'll give you a human design reading if you can give me an astrology reading. Like I was getting, you know, I was doing readings all the time. And I just wanted, it just was like this crutch of like, okay, I need these readings to like remember like my worth. Or connect to my worth. And it just was not healthy. Like one reading is fine, I think, you know, but more it becomes like I would start asking the question of like, why are you getting so many readings? Like what's up? So that's number one. So I was like, okay, I don't want to be kind of like a gateway to like introducing people to a tool that they might become dependent on. And then in this case, it's not just human design. This can be like anything. It can be like you know, like psychic readings. It could be astrology. It could be tarot. You know, I didn't want to be in a position where I would like encourage that kind of dependency. I wanted to create a space where people can feel supported, but I was like, I actually don't know. I'm not entirely sure if this is supportive. So that's the first thing. And then the second thing is I found myself spending a lot of time in the reading itself, prefacing it to people, being like, hey, just so you know, like this is a new age tool. It was like invented in the 90s. Like I think it's helpful to give like the history to them. Like it's just a computer tool. Like take it as a form of an invitation for deeper reflection on you and your patterns. So I really tried to decenter like this tool and not make it seem like it was this like mysterious and powerful almighty thing, which you can definitely see sometimes in human design readings, being like, get your human design reading and like your life will change, you know, that kind of thing. I think is that language I think is predatory to say like, oh, your life's going to change, like just pay like $300 for a reading and then you'll get all the answers that you need, because that's not true. Like it doesn't work like that. Like you're not going to get all the answers. And that I felt like it was predatory for me too, because I was also a consumer of this information. I one time spent like $200 for this money formula, this human design money making formula, where this person like sent me an analysis of like what I needed to do to make money based on my human design. And like basically the take home was like, just journal about all the things that you want and the things will happen. So that was, I felt really upset afterwards, because I was like, I can't believe I spent $200 on this. And again, like there was this manifestation language of like, oh, just journal, just say what it is that you want, journal about it every day and it will happen. And it's ridiculous, because I look back at my journal and I did it for like 3 days and I was like, what is this? Like, why am I journaling about like how much money I want in my bank account? Like it just felt very like not me. It felt very, I didn't feel like myself. Like looking back, I was like, what is this? But anyway, so all this to say that I feel these questions deeply about accountability and about the ethics of being a guide and a mentor, because that line between guiding and then becoming a person on which someone can like really rely on and depend on, I think is a really like, it's a really delicate line. And I was like, you know what? To me, it's not worth it. It's going to haunt me forever. So I was like, I would rather just walk away and do something else that is less delicate. And even though I still feel that line, I still walk that line as a content creator, I feel it less though. I feel it less than if I was like one-on-one in a one-on-one relationship, because I feel like, yeah, there's but the thing on the flip side is that one-on-one relationship, there's more space for nuance. There's more space for developing and fostering and creating the relationship that is healthy, versus, also content creation. It's a whole different beast, content creation, because, that's how spiritual influencers like gain a lot of clout and followers, and people who are sometimes like in vulnerable times in their life where they are looking for answers. So already like looking for answers is going to prime you towards gravitating towards people that like already project like the whole like, I have it all figured out, I'm going to give you the answers. And that's what happened to me when I was in this like sabbatical year, leaving academia and feeling very lost. I was a prime candidate for like the kind of like answers that human design provides. And kind of like went down that path, and it ultimately was not. And it's interesting because now like I feel like I kind of came out of that haze, and I don't need human design anymore, and I don't gravitate towards it anymore, and I completely like erased it from my brain. Like I forgot 90% of everything that I studied. I just took it out. I was like, okay, I don't need you. File empty trash. Yeah.
So
go
sorry.
ahead, Karan.
No, you go.
I was gonna say there's been a lot of tools along the way of like me learning and growing, where it's like this has been helpful to give me some information to help me get out of my head. But yeah, what taking it to and then just being like, this is my identity now, and not really thinking too much about where that's going has been something that has been a conversation in my head with my husband too, of like, okay, yeah, this has helped me, but now like how do I
Now
use
what?
this tool? Now what? And what steps can I take next? Yeah. And go ahead, Karan. What were you going to say?
I don't remember.
Oh. But yeah, like now what? Like I want to learn more. I want to do better in this world, which part of that is learning about me and how I'm navigating the world. But then now what? Now how do I navigate the world in an ethical way, in a humane way, in a way that isn't based on colonialism and white supremacy as well?
That's such a real question. And I think it's very cool that you're both life coaches and that you're asking these questions and you're interested. I think I attract people in the healing spiritual industry that are interested in like remaining in that profession, but don't want to do it in this like preachy priestly way of like, I'm the leader, I'm just going to tell you what to think, I'm just going to, because then ultimately that just kind of like repackages this like Christian and also colonial format of knowledge transference. Like it's this idea that the teacher, the spiritual teacher, is on a pedestal and knows everything and has it all figured out and is therefore like hierarchically like higher than their followers, and then therefore the followers just need to look up. Like this kind of like unilateral like power dynamic is very colonial, because think about like colonization. It was like, you know, like European countries going into the rest of the world and saying, I'm better than you, and I'm going to take this country, or I'm going to take this land and make it mine and extract from it, and you guys are all inferior. Like the idea of like you know, Africans, indigenous people from all around the world were viewed as quote unquote primitives or quote unquote savages. That kind of inferiority therefore created the sense that like the white man had this like civilizing purpose in the rest of the world. So anyway, all this to say, like we see that recycled in leadership, in the idea of like spiritual leadership, that like one person or a group of people are enlightened and awakened and superior, and they have all the tools to help other people. It's like very like one way. So I think a way to decolonize that leadership dynamic is to actually say, no, it's not one way. It's not like I'm just going to teach you. I also have something to learn from you, and let's try to equalize that relationship. So instead of it being like one is above the other, we're trying to democratize it and equalize it and say, actually, we're horizontal now. We're all on the same level, and I have as much to learn from you as and so it's horizontal and also decentral. Like we'll try to decentralize so it doesn't revolve around this one person who's like helping everybody and teaching everybody, but we're all teaching each other and we can all question each other. Like it's very important to be able to question and to create like this culture of like, I'm just because you're saying it doesn't mean it's true kind of thing. Because there is no such thing as like objective, you know, knowledge that is above I mean, that's my school of thought anyway. Like, I don't believe that there is like one objective truth. I think there's truths with a capital, truths with a small s at the end, like plural, and that people, when they like put out knowledge, like it's deeply influenced by who they are, where they're at, etc. So yeah, like in terms of like the ethics and accountability of leadership, how can we make that relationship, that space more horizontal, less centralized around one person? And how can we also debunk this idea that the leader has all the answers? So I think that's, for me, like embodying complexity and embodying contradictions is very important. And I like to say this frequently on my social media, is that I don't have all the answers. So like, please don't look at me like I'm an authority, because I don't want to be an authority. Because then that would be like, you know, but it's complicated, because sometimes I do want to be viewed as an authority, because I'm like, no, I do know what I'm talking about. Like, stop trying to discredit me. Like, I know what I'm talking about. But it does, just because I know I have credentials and I know what I'm talking about, doesn't mean like I'm right, or that you have to believe me, or I'm going to make you believe me. You know what I mean? Like, it just, so I think all of these things are important. And I see people in like the healing space and people in the position of guiding feel the pressure to have it all figured out, or have to embody this like very clean and curated life because that's what people want. But it's like, no, actually embody the mess, embody the contradictions, like share with us that you're also going through stuff, because that's also going to help people realize that you're not on a pedestal, and that you don't need to be in order to be in a position of like helping people out. So framing the mentorship relationship not as a saviorism. It's not a saviorism. It's not like work with me because I'm going to save you, but which is, that colonial thing of like the white man's burden with the colonized people, be like, I'm going to save you. I'm going to pull you out of your like savagery. So it's not a saviorism, but it's a form of support. It's more like, actually, like, this world is really tough. The world that we live in is really tough. And hyper individualism makes you think that you need to just navigate this on your own, and that you have to pull your own bootstraps. But like, hello, you don't. First of all, it's not true. Like, people who succeed in this world have support, and usually have a lot of support. And it's not just support in terms of like emotional support, it's also like capital and generational wealth and all these things. So like, get as much support as you can, and I'm here to support you, and I have the qualifications, and I have experience supporting people, and I'm happy to be there for you. So it's more of like a suggestion, it's more of an invitation. And the invitation is based on this idea of like, support yourself, like get help. Like, it takes a village for you to succeed, and you don't have to do it on your own. So
yeah. I mean, there's like there's a couple, like a contradictory in my mind. Like, I don't think Kristen and I have ever, in terms of our coaching, been like, we're going to be the savior at all.
Nope, not me.
Versus like the idea that no one's coming to save you, right? So no one's coming to save you means that you do have to take action, but then how do you balance that with the whole, like, like you said, pull yourself up by your bootstraps kind of mentality? And where's the balance between not being a savior and no one's coming to save you? Like, it seems contradictory to me. And yet there's like, where is that lays in the middle? Right? Like, I think as coaches, we want to be there to support and guide, and the people that we work with, they have to do the hard work, right? So there is that, no one's coming to save you. Kristen and I are not coming to save you. You do have to do it yourself, and with help. And I think one of the things that we've always said is we're not looking to be the coach with all the right answers. We want to be the coaches with the right questions. Because I think it is a lot about that self-critical thinking of really asking, like, what do you want for yourself and for your life that can move people in the right direction? And there is no one right answer for anybody, and certainly not one that we could give them, because we'll probably get it wrong. But yeah, just those two things can feel almost contradictory, that no one's coming to save you, and but also we're not your savior.
I think that's I'm really glad you brought this up, because I think what happens with my content and my perspective is that I push it a little bit more to the extreme of like, let's think about society, let's think about social dynamics, because I find that the spiritual healing, life coaching, guiding space tends to be super focused on the individual. So I try to balance it out, but it's definitely like the role of the individual agency, personal work is super, super important. So I think sometimes I think I get mistaken for saying like, oh, like in individual agency or like personal, like doing the work yourself, like doesn't matter. Not that you're saying that, but I'm remembering a post that I did where someone interpreted it that way. And so that made me reflect and realize like, okay, I am presenting a specific perspective to counterbalance like how heavy the emphasis is on hyper individualism. So but what I'm hearing you say is like, okay, well, we're trying to acknowledge like how big systems work and like how capitalism like shapes us and society shapes us and systemic barriers, but does that mean that we should not like try to like navigate that, or we shouldn't do the work to push back? That's a true contradiction, but it's also a very productive one, because I think like there is so much space for individual agency and like mindset work and working on the self and growth and all that stuff. I think that's super, super important, especially for minorities and people of color and women and queer folks who've been told societally that they're like less than, or led to believe that, you know, they need to shrink themselves, or that, you know, so it's important for to undo that. Like I think there's a lot of work to be done to break generational patterns and create like um I don't know, like invite and support people in their like flourishing and in taking up space. um so I think that's very important, and so we can do that work and at the same time add the social layer and say like, hey, maybe in this situation it's not your fault, like it's not that you were not enough or that you didn't do the work, but like in this situation it might have been like something social. So I think it kind of lifts the emphasis. What happens when the emphasis is always on the individual is that it can create blame when there's failure. So it's like, oh, I failed because I didn't, you know, like want it hard enough, or I didn't, there was like a subconscious block within me that didn't want it hard, you know, things like that. Like that can be more of like the toxic spirituality stuff. So if we're able to do that work on the self without falling into the blame of like, oh well, if this thing didn't pan out for me, it's not because I'm not doing the work, or like I'm bad, or I'm lazy, or something like that. So I think that's why it's helpful also to have a mentor and be like, hey, it's not your fault, like you're doing great. Like sometimes it's good to have that source of nurturing support. So it's like a balance. I mean, I'm sure I love how you framed like the way that you work with your clients, because I can hear like the nurturing aspect to it, and also like the deep concern. And it's like, yeah, you're not here to save anyone. You're here to guide and support and nurture and ask the right questions so that they can also like do the work. So it's like that balance, I think, of reminding people that like there's a personal scale, and then there's a societal scale, and what they can control is the personal. But we can also work on the societal at the same time, you know.
Yeah. And so how do we do that in this space? Like, how do we, you know, I'd love to snap my fingers and like, you know, everything is perfect in the world, but how do we go about working to create that change? And like, and even in just like, you know, dismantling white supremacy and you know, systemic racism and all of the things that are I would say holding back like people of color and the queer people and transgendered people. Like, how do we as coaches or leaders or even content creators impact those changes positively?
Yeah, it's a really great question. I think for me it always starts with like education, and listening and looking for the folks who are already doing that work, so that like, you know, we don't have to reinvent the wheel. And also remembering like, okay, well, what are my strengths, like what can I bring to the space, like what can I do? And it can be like small, it doesn't have to be big, but even like I just always remember that like activists, especially like folks of color that are like working and organizing, like the biggest favor that we can do is to listen and learn, and like actually like ask them, okay, like what is it that we can do? What is it that we can do to like start, you know, like helping out and contribute? So I think that kind of lifts the pressure off also of having, because leadership is sometimes like taking a step forward, and then sometimes it's like, you know, looking for the people who are already doing something, and then supporting them in the process. So like, for instance, like I think maybe like in a coaching space, I'm not sure what that can look like, but maybe like doing trainings or getting trainings or offering trainings, being like, hey, like we want to work with this person because she has an amazing perspective, like, and let's bring her in, like, things like that.
Mhm.
Also, like if it's possible to like fund people or give your business to people that are like non-white, in a predominantly white space,
Mhm.
or like for life coaching, like maybe, I don't know if there's like scholarships available to people of color to become life coaches, to create that opportunity. Like there's a lot of different layers
Mhm.
of getting involved in organizations, starting also with like the communities that you live in, like the cities that you live in. I know, like for us, like Canadians, like actively making sure that, first of all, we're not participating in the erasure of like Indigenous people.
Mhm.
um I know for like Americans as well, but like for me in Canada, like Indigenous people are like such a huge part of the population, and they still like exist and like they exist. I feel like in the US they've been so like, um I think like the percentage of like Indigenous people is like point something percent.
Mm-hmm.
In Canada, the population is larger, and we just, I don't know, like for me, Indigenous erasure is huge. And I like, it starts with knowing the history of the um indigenous like tools and beliefs that are being appropriated. And then also, like, anytime I have a platform, I try to amplify Indigenous voices. Like, I just literally now with my platform, I just like funnel people into all these like POC Indigenous creators that I like. And I'm like, hey, follow them. They're doing great work with them, fund them, donate to them, things like that. So it's like, I think with a platform comes a responsibility.
Mhm.
So yeah, these are just like some thoughts, but mostly like, yeah, I think for me, like it's also a lot of like listening and educating myself. Um, and like not taking up space where I don't need to,
Mhm.
and just like passing my platform on
Mhm.
to other people to take up space.
Mm-hmm.
I think
Yeah.
that's a big one too, because I think oftentimes we come in on as a white person, come in on an issue that is not our own, and we try to add our voice rather than amplify the voices of the people that are actually dealing with the issues or the leaders in those spaces. I notice that a lot on like different social media platforms, right? So yeah, the idea of amplifying the voices and the leaders in those communities that are already doing something rather than trying to start conversations of our own with issues that don't have anything to do with us, if that makes sense. What I'm trying to say.
Yeah, like yeah, if you're having conversations like like around decolonization or like Indigenous appropriation, like get people um to participate in those conversations with you, you know
Mhm.
um I use the metaphor of like, how all these like men do podcasts and talk about, or not just podcasts, but like they like to like talk about like the role as men
Mhm.
in society, and they're trying to be like enlightened men. And it's
Mhm.
like there's not a single woman in that space like to talk about like, patriarchy. And it's like,
Mm-hmm.
okay, so you're just gonna have a group of men talk about like your role as men, but like not at all engage with women and
Mhm.
like your role and how you're impacting women. So like the same metaphor is like, well, okay, if we're trying to talk about like decolonization and like I think it's important and soothing and comforting to have spaces that are like, you know, say like just for like white folks to like process. That's important. But also it's also important to have spaces where you're working with POC and Black
Mhm.
folks and Indigenous folks in like decolonizing. I think they are two-pronged, they go together. So yeah, so I have like some creators that I recommend and funnel people to that are specifically for white folks to reconnect with their like heritage.
Mhm.
So these are like white creators that like are trying to practice a form of like decolonized spirituality. So I think they're setting out they're great role models out there
Mhm.
that are trying to do the work, and they're also like they're on my platform, they engage with me, and they've studied with me, and they're like clearly very hungry to do like good work. And then the second pronged approach is, you know, working with creators, content creators, healers, coaches that are non-white, that also can, you know, offer a very important and constructive perspective. Because again, it takes a village. So like the idea that one person is going to be like, one coach can be everything to everybody, or like be everything to that one person, is not possible. Yeah.
Well, and we had kind of started talking about this before we started recording, but the idea of and we've sort of touched on cultural appropriation here, of like, of white people having, you know, this lack of culture, or trying to reconnect rather than appropriating other culture, spirituality, which we see a lot in our space for sure. And so, I mean, you mentioned that you have some content creators that like are doing that. Anything else that you could share around that, kind of that idea of like, I know, because we kind of started talking about it earlier, but you know, as what we had said, it was like, as immigrants coming to this country, or either Canada or the US, and completely losing touch with any of our culture that we had from before, from wherever we're originally from. It feels very much like, I can only speak personally, like that we're like cultureless, and trying to connect some way with something. And I think that's where a lot of the cultural appropriation comes from, because they'll see other cultures and they'll be like, that really resonates with me, so I'm just going to take that for myself. And yeah, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, I think what happens with colonization is that it hurts everybody. Although it like also like benefits a certain group of population, but it hurts everybody in the sense that like colonization is also rooted in this like rational system. This like idea of rationality is, you know, originated. I mean, it comes from, we see it all the way back in like Aristotle and Plato, but I think rationality is a very important part of I think it was like a tool of colonization, in the sense that European colonizers saw themselves as rational, whereas the people that they colonized, they portrayed as irrational, as childlike, as not having fully developed rational capabilities. So rationality was a huge part of that way of facilitating and legitimizing the colonial enterprise. So the thing is with rationality is that it also eliminates the possibility for irrational or, you know, spiritual things that are not seen as rational. So that's first of all, like, and second of all, the only space that, you know, European colonizing cultures allowed for non-rationality was religion and Christianity. It was Christianity. So that was the only space where you could be like a little bit mystical. But even then it was very codified, like, you know, very codified way of practicing spirituality was this religious thing. And Christianity was also used as part of the colonial enterprise as a way to legitimize colonization. So you have religion and you have rationality. And what that does is that it kind of like slowly eroded all European cultural practices that were not rational, that were pagan, that were animistic, that were rooted in the land. So those ultimately like all died eventually, because it's like Christianity just like superseded everything. It just rooted itself, and it became like the dominant form of spirituality, and then everything else is blasphemous. So you have that. And with colonization, when Europeans started colonizing the rest of the world, they also demonized these like spiritual mystical practices, because they were, you know, like it was blasphemous. So therefore, you know, as they were trying to make Christianity become more dominant, and they're trying to Christianize and convert the colonized peoples, they were basically saying like, yeah, this is this medicine woman shaman thing, or this like, this prayers, like, let's eliminate that. And so people were demonized and punished for having like their indigenous local mystical practices. So the whole world was affected by colonization, because like mysticism was like eliminated or erased, so in some places like that mysticism survived a little bit, maybe like morphed, or parts of it survived, but like in some other places it just completely like disappeared. So all this to say, that even like, for instance, for me, like I am Lebanese and Egyptian, and like Egypt is a place of deep magic. It's really magical and very like energetically powerful, and but you really have to, like, my grandma is very Christian, like very like religious, and like you can't talk about spirits around her. But like I'll talk to other people about spirits and they'd be like, yeah, totally, spirits, like yeah, like I even saw one the other day. Like it really depends. Like you have a variety of people that like will have different positions and levels of like experience with like non-Christian spirituality, or in the case of like Egypt, it can also be like the dominant religion, which is Islam. So but then there's also parts of religion that are like more mystical, like if you think of like Sufism or something. But anyway, the point that I'm trying to get to, like besides this like general history that I'm drawing about like colonization, rationality, and mysticism, is that like white folks are not the only ones who have been divorced from their spirituality or have been divorced from their spiritual practices, some more than others. So like there's different groups might have like a tighter connection to their spirituality, and for some it's more obvious. It's like, yeah, like the Orishas, or like, yeah, like Hinduism or whatever. But so part of the project of reconnecting to one's specific heritage, to me, actually also involves a process of excavation, because you have to go back to a time where these practices were embraced, and you have to go back in time to before these practices were demonized. And it's about reconnecting to one's heritage and to one's like ancestral homelands. So I think ancestor work and ancestor connection, and like connecting to the culturally specific ancestors, like that can be really interesting, especially for white people in North America, because it's important to remember that whiteness is not neutral. It's not, we think of it as neutral, we think of it as having no color. And juxtaposed against whiteness, you have like ethnicities, you have race, because these have color. So we want to actually like debunk this idea that whiteness has no culture, or whiteness has no cultural valency, and say instead, no, actually, like there is culture, let's excavate it, let's bring it back. Because once you do that, and once you connect to your cultural heritage, then there's no need to look at other cultures and say like, okay, well, I'm going to start burning Palo Santo, even though it has nothing to do with my culture, I don't fully understand it. Or even worse, the whole industrialization or commodification of closed indigenous practices like ayahuasca that are not open. These are not open practices, and yet there's entire spiritual tourism industry that talks about that. A creator that I absolutely love, Activated Living, is a Guarani indigenous amazing person based in California, and she does like really good content about ayahuasca and talks about it. So she's a really good like reference point for that, and I learned a lot from her about the spiritual tourism that happens in like Latin America around ayahuasca. But like so all this to say, like, it's important for white folks to remember they do have culture. But it's harder to get back to, but it's important to get back to that, so that there is no like, so that we can actually be like transparent about the appropriation, the commodification that happens. Because what happens when like something as spiritual and closed as ayahuasca becomes a commodity, and it becomes an entire like capitalistic industry? it becomes destroyed. It destroys it for indigenous people who actually practice it. So it becomes expensive. It becomes like messy. It becomes really messy. So it's important to reconnect to the heritage, even though it's hard. And even for me, like it's hard because I'm like, you know, colonization really erased and demonized a lot of the traditions that were in place. And I'm sure that's the case for a lot of like colonized countries. So colonized people also have to do the work of excavating. And it's going to be hard too, because some of these practices may have disappeared or need to be like really like, you're going to have to like tease it out of your like great grandma to pull out, you know, like I was just asking my dad, I was like, so, cause like evil eye is like really strong for us, but you know, evil eye has also been like something that's been like appropriated, like, so I was like, yeah, like daddy, like, do you know how to reject an evil eye? Like, how do you know when you've been touched by the evil eye, and do you know how to reject it? And, or like push it back or like undo it. And he was like, no, I don't know, but like your grandma would have known. He was like, maybe ask your aunt, like she might know. But like I'm shy about asking because like it's not Christian to ask that, you know, like it's not Christian, like, but you know, in so many places spirituality coexisted with Christianity, and like think there's some things that like my grandma probably did that were spells, but like she just did them, things like that, you know, that like coexisted with Christianity. So it's hard, like that work is hard, but like that's the part of spirituality that I'm drawn to. And I think that's the part of spirituality that's also like going to be revolutionary, because it helps us like it helps us question colonization. It helps us like push back against like the effects of colonization by saying like, actually I'm gonna do that excavation for myself and for like that purpose of reconnecting with my ancestors.
Yeah, thank you for that. Okay, we're kind of running out of time.
Yeah, we could go on forever.
Keep going here.
We want to respect your time as well.
Where can our listeners go to find out more about you and what you're up to?
Yeah, absolutely. If you have TikTok, definitely follow me on there. My account is it's Classic Steph. That's my handle. I have the same handle for Instagram. I offer courses. So I offered live workshops this summer. I did a whole decolonial summer school. And some of those courses, those workshops are available. The replays are available. And I know the replays are just as enjoyable as the live class. Like from what I've learned from students, like students really are liking the replays. So you can go to my Podia. I have a Podia community and a Podia workshop platform. So it's basically, my website is classicsteph.podia.com, which you can also find from my like link in bio if you follow me on social. So those workshops are going to be, they're available for replay. You can purchase them anytime. And if you join my newsletter, then I'll keep you posted on like the next time I do a live workshop. Cool. Yeah, and my courses like feel very much like a college course. They're dense, they're really rich in information. So I don't know, I'm like kind of thinking about maybe offering like a full-fledged like semester-long or month-long course at some point. We'll see if there's like enough interest to do that, because then I'll be able to like really like assign readings and homework, and I think it could be really, really fun to do that.
Absolutely.
So yeah.
Well, I just want to thank you so much for coming on here and sharing so much with us. I know I learned a lot, and I'm sure our listeners will as well.
Thank you so much for having me. It was an absolute pleasure. I really enjoyed this conversation and speaking with you, and like, thank you for continuing to ask these questions and like, you know, be really interested in the project of decolonizing, you know, the coaching space as well.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.